Let me ask you a question. Who owns you? You might be inclined to ask, well, what do you mean, who owns me? If I have to ponder the idea of somebody owning me, then that somebody would obviously be me, would it not? And you are absolutely correct, and you should make no bones about it. I agree that you own you, but why do I ask? I ask because most of us think and act in ways that are not concordant with that basic truism, the fact that you own yourself. We behave and think in ways that directly contradict that very premise. So let's start very rudimentary. What does ownership imply? What does it mean to own something? The most accurate definition of ownership I have found is this: he who owns something has the exclusive right to decide what is done with that particular thing. Let us use that as our foundation from whence we will attempt to discover whether you truly own yourself or not. When you own a car, you have the exclusive right to decide what is done with that car. It is you and only you who decides whether somebody may borrow that car from you, whether it is painted blue, red, black or any other color, and whether somebody else may claim ownership of the car if you decide to trade with them. Your judgment is always primary. Nobody else's judgment has any higher authority over the vehicle than you do. The same principle may apply consistently to owning a house. When you wish to rent that house to somebody, or want to paint the house a different color, or want to build a deck in your backyard, it is you and only you who makes that decision, because you own the house and nobody else does. If I rent that house from you and I want to build a deck, I need your permission to be able to do so, because I don't own it, you do. The judgment of the owner is always primary. Now, with that out of the way, we can also apply this premise of ownership to the possession of a somebody rather than a something. And of course, some of you might say, own somebody else? How can you own somebody else? Well, consider the premise of slavery. Slavery implies that one individual or group of individuals owns another individual. And if you own something or somebody, in this case, they are your property. The individual who owns the other individual as his slave, the slave master, has the exclusive right to decide what is done with the slave. If the slave wants to possess something or do something or go somewhere, he needs his master's permission to be able to do so. The judgment of the slave master has the highest authority over the slave. The slave's judgment is always secondary and is principally irrelevant. He is not allowed to decide his own destiny for himself because he does not own himself. The slave master does. And so it is the slave master who may decide what the slave can or cannot do, what is going to happen with his body, and how much he is allowed to keep of the fruits of his own labor. The exclusive right to decide is the chief principle of ownership. Of course, you will have the occasional benevolent slave master who will allow his slaves to be more free, who will allow his slaves to keep more of what they produce rather than take it all, who will allow his slaves to have more privileges under his helm. A slave master may allow his slaves to keep 25% of what they produced, and if they're really lucky, they may even be allowed to keep 50 or 75%. But what makes it still slavery? Well, just look at the word allowed. I, as your authority or owner, will allow you to keep more of what you earn. Well, if they are allowing you, that means that it's up to them to decide whether you get to keep as much or not, which means that they have the exclusive right to decide what is done with what you've produced with your own time, energy, and efforts. The slave doesn't get to decide how much he can keep of what he has earned. The master decides that. The one with the exclusive right to decide what is done with somebody's body or the fruits of his labor is the owner. So, what does it mean to own oneself? To own oneself is to have the exclusive right to decide what is done with you. You come into this mysterious macrocosm of a reality with your own beautiful body. You have a certain amount of time in this life. You and you alone decide what you do with that time. You may trade your time, energy, and attention for resources or mediums of exchange with which you could acquire other resources in order to sustain your life. And it is you and you alone who decides what is going to happen with your body. and all the fruits of the labor that you were able to produce with it. You've given your time, energy, and attention in exchange for that money, or whatever resource it may be. You've given a piece of your own life for those resources that you've acquired with it, and thus only you decide what is done with them. Somebody else may ask you if they could have some of your rightfully acquired resources, usually in exchange for other resources that are commensurate with their value, or you may give something for free, but it's still you who gets to decide whether you do that or not. Just like with the car or the house, you own it. Your volition is paramount. Nobody else gets to decide that for you, because you have the highest authority over yourself. You have the exclusive right to decide what is done with your own body, your own time, energy, attention, and everything that you've been able to rightfully acquire with it. And ultimately, you own your life. Now, does our current existence within this system of control under the helm of government coincide with the former, the slave-master relationship, or the latter, you owning yourself? And just be honest with yourself. Are you really in charge of what you spend your own time, energy, and efforts on? Are you really the one who has the exclusive right to decide what is done with your own body and your own possessions? Or does the government proclaim to have that right, when they demand that you hand over a large sum of what you've rightfully earned and force you to make decisions with your own body and with your own time that you'd rather not make if you had the choice? The fact that you don't have a choice, the fact that it's not up to you to decide what gets to happen with your own property, implies that you really do not have the exclusive right to decide, but they do, and ultimately means that you do not own yourself and the fruits of your labor, but they do. And if somebody owns somebody else, then that is the definition of slavery. Well, of course, the inevitable response will likely be akin to, well, that's the law. And what? The law is somehow sacrosanct? Well, if we look at history, it doesn't seem like it. Slavery was enacted into law, and anybody who helped slaves escape was doing something that was against the law. Hiding Jews during the reign of the Third Reich was against the law. During the Nuremberg trials, the Nazis resorted to the good old, "I was just doing my job, I was just enforcing the law" excuse. But that didn't justify their actions, did it? So the fact that something is made into law does not mean that it's the right thing to do. Obviously, many of you watching would probably say that you would have disobeyed those immoral laws during those days, and rightfully so. That you would have done the right thing regardless of what the law said. But that means that there are exceptions to following the law, does it not? If there are exceptions for following the law, then who decides what those exceptions are? You or the authorities? I'm pretty sure that will be you, right? So then it is not for the authority to determine whether you obey its whims, but you yourself. So your own discernment always stands above the law, and you decide when you abide by it or not. And that can only mean one thing: that law and authority in fact do not stand above your own moral conscience and judgment, and that they therefore possess no authority at all. If the authority depends on how many people adhere to it and believe in it, then there is no authority. Imagine somebody saying, "I am obligated to do what he says unless I choose not to." In that case, there is no obligation at all, and thus there is no such thing as government authority. If you're the final arbiter, if you get to decide when you have to obey, then it isn't authority. Authority means the right to rule, which implies the obligation to obey, and if you don't have an obligation to obey, then it doesn't have the right to rule. This brings us to another significant element of self-ownership. Who owns your judgment? Who gets to decide what choices you make in life? In life, we always have to make choices. We have to bear the consequences of those choices. Oftentimes, those consequences are negative, sometimes they are positive. These consequences help us learn and gain experience, with which we can avoid making those same choices again in the future, the ones that have negative results. We make mistakes so that we learn from them. In order to make a choice in life, we must use our own rational and moral judgments in order to find out if the consequences of those choices are worth bearing. Choices often include risks, and we alone should be free to take those risks or avoid them altogether. Every time throughout history when man was forbidden to think and act in accordance with his own rational and moral judgments, and was physically coerced into thinking and acting according to how some political ruler wanted people to think and act, the most horrible atrocities throughout history had eventuated. We as a species are always learning. We are always innovating, progressing, growing, and advancing. It isn't even that long ago that we believed that smoking was actually healthy, that we had to spray ourselves with DDT every day, and that we thought that mercury and arsenic were suitable remedies for conditions of ill health. And at every point we believed that we knew it all, but we were proven wrong by reality. Now, of course, that is the essence of learning and becoming wiser than you were before, by gaining experience. However, the crucial point is that when we adopt a system of collectivism, we as individuals are forced to make the same mistakes the collective is making. For example, there are always minorities of people who recognize and point out the logical errors and irrationalities behind the diktats enforced by whoever's in charge of the collective, and their criticisms are always answered with vilification, demonization, harassment, violence, and even extermination. And when the mistakes of the collective become apparent enough, that's when we usually start to understand that it was a bad idea. When one is able to use his own rational judgments, his own discernment, and his own moral judgments, such mistakes do not have to affect us all. It is only when we are all forced to partake in somebody else's supposedly great master plan that we are all forced to bear the consequences of those mistakes. And as I've said, we are still not at the peak of human civilization, not even close. We are still making mistakes, but why should other people's mistakes and consequences be our mistakes and consequences? Who would rather choose to do things that are rational and moral on a voluntary basis, rather than letting one of us impose his plan on the rest of us, and allowing him to use coercion and threats of violence to make us do what he wants, until enough people die and suffer that we realize that it was actually a bad idea to let him do that? Maybe you should let people make their own decisions, rather than assuming that you can make other people's decisions for them, because you think that you're somehow superior to everybody else. When politicians demand that we take certain risks that might cost us our health or the health of our children, you see, a risk without choice is not a risk, it is assault. Forcing somebody to play Russian roulette and forcing them to pull the trigger is still an act of assault. The thing about risks, which very few statists seem to grasp, is that they can have horrendous outcomes. When a politician or the collective demands that we participate in a taking of various risks to our own well-being, or the well-being of our children and other loved ones, then we are also forced to bear the consequences of those risks. Again, it is critical that an individual applies his own rational faculty and discerns whether it is safe or unsafe to take an injection, for instance, based on the available information. And when a certain injection is still in the middle of its safety trials, can cause detrimental side effects, and can even result in death, then it is of paramount importance that the individual is able to apply prudence and rigor before he exposes himself to such enormous risks. Also considering the fact that when the product's manufacturers and complicit governments try to make such valuable information unavailable to the consumer, and even go as far as to censor other individuals who share their negative experience with that product, and even want to force you to take their products using threats of aggression, then it should be clear that such a risk is not worth taking. Or the draft. I'm going to force you to go out and murder whoever I tell you to murder. I'm going to force you to risk your own life and to be a chess piece in our war games. And if you refuse, I'll put you in a cage for several years. If there has ever been an example of somebody claiming ownership of your body, i.e. slavery, the draft would be it. But when an individual is forced to take such an enormous risk, what does that tell you? Do you have the exclusive right to decide what is done with your own body? Or does the government have that right? Do you own your own body? Or does the government own your body? Deeply contemplate that question, please. Of course, we are social creatures. We enjoy the company of our beloved fellow men and women. We prosper and work better and more efficiently when we work together. We want to love each other, respect each other, and help each other. However, this is not the same as the collectivist premise. The most important thing is who owns the individual. Who decides what the individual is allowed to keep of what he produces, and what decisions he shall or shall not make with his own life? Who is going to decide the individual's life for him? The individual or the collective? Obviously, that would only be the individual himself. The individual owns himself. He decides what he will do with the fruits of his own labor, which he gave his own time, energy, and attention for in order to earn it. He traded a piece of his life for the resources he rightfully acquired. His life, his body, and his resources solely belong to him. The individual owns himself, and he and only he will decide his own destiny. And surely, if we own ourselves, we make our own decisions. We decide how we spend our own money, our time, with whom we spend our own time, and to what endeavors we dedicate our energy and attention. The judgment of the individual is primary, and that constitutes true individualism. He is not owned by the collective. His life and his labor are not the property of some group or state. His path in this mysterious realm called life is solely for him to explore and experience as he sees fit, for as long as he doesn't forcibly impede other individuals from doing the same. Again, every single time that a collective or a state owns the individual and forbids the individual to make his own decisions and to use his own rational judgment and moral conscience, the worst tragedies in history have eventuated as a result. An individual can choose to join a group and work together with others, but only on a voluntary basis. It's time to wake up and realize that you've been convinced to put up with your own enslavement. Living under the helm of a government is no different than living under the helm of a slave master. It still claims to possess the exclusive right to decide what is done with you, your body, and the fruits of the labor that you were able to produce with it. You still need their permission to do anything with what you've been allowed to use or do. They still decide how much they will allow you to keep of what you rightfully earn with your own time and effort. And they still get to decide what you get to do with your own body. So based on this foundation of ownership and self-ownership that we've laid out, we can accurately define what freedom actually means, what it means to not be a slave. Freedom has always been touted as something arbitrary and elusive. Postmodernists frequently argue that it is merely a subjective construct of the human mind, but basic logic will defy this short-sighted understanding of the concept of freedom. Freedom is the right to decide your own destiny and to make your own decisions, unrestricted by any compulsion. It has also been colloquially described as the right to say no. Nobody else makes your decisions for you because you have the highest authority over yourself, and nobody else does. Nobody owns you. You own you. In a system of government and rulership, you never own yourself. You are never free. Surely some people may insist that some individuals may need leaders to guide them, and I do not disagree, but the truth is, even if people really need somebody to lead them, they are still in charge of themselves, because they are still deciding for themselves whether they will take the advice or guidance or not. It would be pretty insane for somebody to say, I want you to force me to do things whether I agree with them or not. Again, the individual's judgment is always primary. No man can or should ever have the power to force others to subordinate themselves to his will. He may persuade others, he may guide others, he may teach others, but he may not constrain, for it is the results of his guidance that validate the veracity of his guidance. In other words, if a leader has a good reputation, and if his advice and guidance help people improve their own lives, he does not need compulsion in order to get people to do what he wants them to do. And if he happens to be wrong and gets people to do things that serve only himself rather than the people who follow his guidance, then people always possess the freedom to withdraw their participation and to simply say no and move on. This is what brings us to the ultimate distinction. A free society doesn't exclude leadership, but what it does exclude is rulership. Man is not too incompetent and too ill-witted to govern his own life and to organize and cooperate with his own fellow men and women on a voluntary basis. He has only been convinced by incessant indoctrination that those individuals who make up the political ruling class are superior in wisdom and intelligence regarding every single area of life where we make our decisions. Whether it pertains to our financial life, our health, or our children, the notion is always promulgated that those third parties know better than us. Such a dubitable notion has of course been too tritely expressed, to the point where it has now lost its credibility, because it has never stood up to the test of time. But still, it is the instilled programming of such a notion at a very young age that inclines individuals to say, but what about this? And how will we do this without government? When we truly give up the notion that politicians know how to spend our money better than we do, then we, the actual individuals who bear the consequences of our decisions, will make much better decisions than politicians, who don't bear any consequences for their poor and detrimental decisions, and can continue to make them whether we like them or not, for as long as we continue to believe in that ridiculous notion. If the person who spends your money doesn't bear the same consequences as you would if you had to make that same decision, you can be sure that the likelihood of him being prudent and efficient with your money is close to zero. Nobody is better at spending your own money than you are. No one is better at running your own business than you are, because you actually have a legitimate incentive to make the best of it. A politician doesn't. It's very easy to spend somebody else's money. We take risks to our own livelihoods and the livelihoods of our loved ones to test out the assertions made by third parties for which they pay no price if they happen to be wrong, nor does the majority that votes for them to force people to take such risks, nor do the enforcers of such diktats. And by the way, restitutions aren't on the resume of politicians, since admitting that you are wrong isn't exactly good promotional material for the next election. And the enforcers of such immoral and detrimental laws will always hide behind the phrase, "I was just doing what I was told. I don't use my judgment. I don't use my conscience like a human being. I just violently enforce whatever I'm told to enforce, like a marionette on strings." The debate shouldn't be about whether we should let politicians make us do the right things or the wrong things, since each side of the political spectrum believes that they're the ones doing the right thing until it doesn't stand up to the test of time. Rather, people should ask themselves the question, since when is it up to other individuals to decide how my money should be spent? Since when do other individuals get to decide what decisions I should be forced to make or prohibited from making? If it's wrong for me and for every other human being to use threats of violence to make people do what I want them to do, which is called coercion, then how does it suddenly become moral when I instead vote for somebody else to do it for me? How does the ballot box, a pen and a piece of parchment alter morality? How does a scribble on parchment turn wrongful behavior into right behavior? And how does one delegate a right that he doesn't even have? Isn't it funny how we all have the right to freedom, yet politicians somehow possess the right to infringe upon our freedom? Let me make something very clear, and I want you to pay close attention. There is no such thing, and there can never be such a thing as a right to infringe upon a right. It is inherently paradoxical. It is logically impossible. I can't make it any more simple than that. Of course, human beings are not perfect. We are not always prudent, we are not always generous, and we are not always benign. But the notion that we need to have a system that will control and rule over everybody as a collective is quite troublesome. As Larkin Rose once said, if people are too stupid, selfish and malicious to be free to make their own decisions, as many people assume, are they also not too stupid, selfish and malicious to be trusted with power over others? So because people are too stupid, selfish and malicious, is it at all a good idea that we ought to give a small portion of those same stupid, malicious, selfish human beings the right to forcibly control and dominate the lives of other people, and give them the societal permission to hurt those who don't do as they say? If you fear other human beings, if the thought of allowing human beings to be free to exercise their own individual judgments and moral conscience is dreadful to you, because you don't trust them and don't know what they have in mind, then who's going to run the system that is supposed to control them? It is quite ironic that when we try to picture a moral, intelligent, honest, compassionate, humble, loving human being, a politician is the last person that comes to mind. Yet we trust them to make our decisions for us and to forcibly take and spend our money in the way they see fit. And we trust them with the power to coerce and assault those who disobey them. And we trust them to use all of that power to serve our interests? If that doesn't sound like a bloody utopia, then I don't know what does. We've been proven wrong for millennia now. Countless precedents of warmongering, manslaughter, domination, democide and corruption, all because we've been repeating the same underlying mistake that we've made since time immemorial, the belief that we must set aside our own judgments, free will and conscience, and instead have to act, think and behave according to how some politician or collective wants us to act, think and behave at any given time, and essentially be the robot of somebody else, with the only possible choice being which person may pull those strings on people's behavior this year, and hoping that the next person who pulls the strings makes people do the right things. That didn't work out well for many people throughout history, so why would it work out now, or ever? Will you go on pretending your life, convincing yourself that you're free? Because you are allowed, you are permitted to have a modicum of freedom, until your masters decide that you are not permitted to have that much freedom anymore? Or you wake up and realize, use your realize and see that this is not the world that you deserve. I've always said that self-respect is the key to freedom. Why? Just dissect the word. Self, meaning yourself. Re, as in again, and spectate, as in to look at. To respect yourself is to look at yourself again. To grasp the fact that you are not a bloody slave, that you don't need anybody's bloody permission, that you own yourself and that nobody could ever have higher authority over your life than you do. You own your life, you own your own time, you own your own energy, you own your own body, you own you, and don't let anybody convince you of the contrary. So the next time some politician tells you, you are not allowed to go outside after 10 PM during our curfew, you are not allowed to keep your business open, you are not allowed to go out without wearing a mask, perhaps at some point I will decide to allow you to have some more freedom again. Tell them, who on earth are you to allow me to do anything? You don't own me, you don't own my body, you don't own my business. Who are you to allow me anything? I'm not your slave, I'm not your property, for you to move around and experiment with as you see fit. I own myself, I own my body, I own my business. Change starts with you. Know how much you're really worth. You're not a chess piece in somebody else's bloody game. You own yourself, and it's time to let them know.